In the history of espionage, there's this seminal but actually not widely known report called the Anderson Report. Anderson and his team were hired by the US Air Force in the early 70s to give a security assessment of this new thing that they were doing called building network computers with whole different types of people accessing them. Now, Anderson and his team were asked to examine one specific threat. They were hired to examine the threat of a malicious user. So put your brain back in like the early 70s. I mean, the computers as we understand them today, things we know about them today, were not self-evident back then. Computers were bigger, they didn't have as much power, and the idea of networking them and putting them together to communicate with each other and have different types of information on them and have like a system was new. And the United States Air Force controlled, as all militaries do, a lot of classified information, sensitive information, and things like, launch codes for nuclear war. This is this early 70s. The Cold War was still raging. And their primary concern, well, at least, according to the report, their primary concern was a malicious user in the shape of somebody either working for the KGB or hired by the KGB. So Anderson comes in with his team and they look at it, and sure enough, the systems, they haven't been designed with security in mind at all. And one of the conclusions actually that he drew right away was that if you don't bake security into these systems from the get-go, it's almost impossible to secure them later. But what's really fascinating about this report is how, in looking at the vulnerabilities presented with the idea of a physical person, like a malicious user, what Anderson and his team ended up doing was identifying a whole bunch of security threats in this new networked computer space, what we would now call like cyberspace and cybersecurity. And that's what makes the report really interesting. There's nothing in it that would blow you away, but that in itself is really cool because as I'm reading it, and I worked in cybersecurity a lot, although I was never very technical. So I'm like nodding, I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Like the safest systems in the world, even today, are the ones that are completely closed, right? Where everybody who can access them is secured to a really, really high clearance level. They're not connected to the internet. They can't come anywhere near the internet. Closed systems, right? But those are really expensive and only useful in very specific contexts. So you're reading it, I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And then I'm like, wait a second, like he wrote this in 1972. And that's what makes it really cool, is that through writing about how a malicious user might get into these systems, he ended up identifying a whole bunch of new thoughts, or newer at the time, about security and what it meant. So like he has this list it comes in 2 volumes. And by the way, if you search up the Anderson report, add the word computers or something, because there are a lot of Anderson reports and the main one that comes up is about like Scientology or something. So just add like computer to it. And so in volume 2, there's this whole list of ways that a user could get inside a system. And some of them were like pretty standard for 1972. Like you have an undercover, operative who gets hired to do something tangential around the base. And then, they can like a cleaner or something, right? And then they can get on a computer and then they can access it because the security was so bad. He evaluated that it would be like nil effort to get in. But he also identifies things that now are standard and actually we still deal with, like Trojan horses, that, creating an enticement, like a program, a little add-on that's so beneficial that'll help you in your work so much that people just adopt it without doing the proper security checks or verifying where it's coming from. He talks a lot about trapdoors. So, the idea of securing a system, if you can't secure and verify where that system came from, who built it, well, he says it could come with a bunch of trapdoors that allow for future access. These are still things that we deal with today. So it's a super, super interesting report. Again, like, unless you're really into the details of the history of cybersecurity, you don't need to read the whole thing. If you want to just read the executive summary at the beginning. But I love the idea of it. Like, sometimes the Anderson report, when I did some research, like, a couple of people like criticize it because like, oh, it doesn't go deep enough. But I mean, like, it's 1972. Even though foundationally these were old problems, the infrastructure that they're using is like created some very new issues. And to get your head around that, I think actually he did a pretty impressive job. And the idea of just saying, okay, we're going to just try to secure this computer against a malicious user, not worrying about what their intentions are, where they're from, or anything like that, just a malicious user, ends up becomes this gateway to understanding and starting the conversation. He was one of the people, there were others, but one of the people who started that conversation about cybersecurity in general. What does it mean to secure a network? Where are these networks vulnerable? And that has, started to get baked into the development of all these technologies after that. Anyway, it's a really cool report. If you're interested, go take a look at it. I'll put a link in the comments. Otherwise, any questions or comments, let me know. Hope everyone's doing wonderful.